Hello, everyone, and welcome to a new session with Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative. We are lucky to have Ernest Johansson to speak to us about kleptomania. Ernest, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Hetham, and thank you for having me. It's always a pleasure to talk about mental health issues that impact the community.
So, what you can tell us about kleptomania?
Well, kleptomania. Um, so on some levels it's kind of misunderstood. And then there are people who do steal habitually who don't have a pattern that would fit definitions of kleptomania. Kleptomania is a behavioral addiction. And to backtrack on, a historical talk we have had about addiction, there's three components of addictive substances, and then behavioral addictions have two of those components. And those components are physiological, psychological, and social. And so kleptomania is a behavioral addiction, so it has the social and the psychological impacts. And any addictive behavior such as kleptomania spikes dopamine levels and causes a brain reaction, and generally addictive patterns are associated with massaging unwanted emotions or feelings or trauma and become out of control when the brain does not have control over the process over engaging in a certain behavior or immediate control. It's like a reactive impulse. That's when it veers into the realm of addiction. And so kleptomania in and of itself is a mental health disorder that involves repeatedly not being able to resist urges to steal items, and typically they're items that the individual doesn't necessarily need. Often the items have very, very little value, if any, or they're imminently affordable. A kleptomaniac might be someone with a middle class income, but likes to steal candy bars from the dollar store, for instance. Um, and a lot of the time, it's not necessarily about the item. It's about the feelings associated with stealing, and it's an impulse. It's rare. It impacts roughly ballpark 1 out of 200 to 1 out of 300 people in North America. So that's a relatively rare behavioral addiction or behavioral disorder. Um, and it can be serious. Sometimes people with kleptomania will steal from their friends, their loved ones, their jobs, and there can be legal ramifications. Uh, and typically, it's kind of a pattern that doesn't always get caught right away until it becomes a major issue. And so it's an impulse control disorder, again, that involves problems with emotional and behavioral self-control. And basically, any impulse control disorder, which can be, it's a behavioral addiction and an impulse control disorder, it's hard to resist the temptation to engage in behaviors that may hurt someone else or hurt oneself. And kleptomania, more so than some other behavioral addictions, but certainly this can be a feature of some behavioral addictions as well. It's a secret life of shame for a lot of people. A lot of the people who engage will have a lot of shame about seeking mental health treatment. And it isn't something where there's a cure per se, but rather it's something that is there are certain skill building therapies or cognitive behavioral therapy that teaches people how to manage the urges in a healthy way. Um, with a physiological addiction, it's very easy to remove the substance. If someone has alcohol, it's very easy, is misstating it. But a mechanism of treatment can be to absolutely abstain from the substance. So if someone has alcoholism, abstaining from alcohol is it's core to the treatments, and then learning how to manage the psychological ramifications of managing urges to drink is part of it. Kleptomania is difficult in that sense, insofar as how do you live without ever going into a grocery store? How do you live without ever going into a shop? How do you live without ever going into someone's house and seeing an item that's like, oh, I'd like to take that. Um, so it's a different animal in that regard. So yes. The general symptoms are an inability to resist urges to steal items that you don't necessarily need. And then there's a lot of anxiety and tension around um, the urge in and of itself. And there's like almost like a state of psychological arousal around the urge itself. Additionally, there's a feeling of intense pleasure or satisfaction while stealing. and then guilt and remorse, self-loathing, or fear, especially fear of arrest, associated with the aftermath. And um, the urges tend to return in people who are truly kleptomaniac or truly have kleptomania. I have down here, it's going to take me a second to pull it up, the DSM criteria, which will be a little bit repetitive to what I just said, but I do think that um, I do think it's good to have the hard evidence that a psychiatrist or psychologist would use to diagnose this disorder. So the current DSM regarding criteria for kleptomania is um, a reoccurring failure to resist impulses. There is a recurrent failure to resist the impulse to steal objects that are not needed for personal use or from their monetary value. An increased sense of tension when it is anticipated that one is going to have the opportunity to or be able to commit a theft. Pleasure or relief after engaging in this act. There's an intense sense of pleasure or gratification. It's not motivated by anger or vengeance. It's not like an expression in the sense of um, I'm going to show you I'm going to steal this item. It's not that at all, and it's also one of the DSM items is the pattern of behavior doesn't fit into another diagnosis. So, antisocial personality disorder or manic episodes can account for theft, or sociopathy can account for theft. It really depends on what is surrounding the thought process around the pattern of theft. Also, people with kleptomania are often, most of the time, typically aware that the behavior is wrong, and they often feel guilt or remorse. And it is, as I said earlier, it's relatively rare, roughly 1 in 200 to 1 in 300 individuals. So that's the DSM criteria. And now I have to go back to my regular notes. Um, and again, this will be a little bit redundant, but basically, quickly, people with kleptomania don't do it for personal gain or to impress their peers or sort of a vengeful act of rebellion, or they steal because the urge is too powerful to resist. That's a very important feature. Um, Kleptomaniac episodes or episodes of kleptomania happen impulsively, generally without planning, and as individuals. I think it's very unlikely that someone who has kleptomaniac features or kleptomania would steal in a group. Um, and generally, the behaviors engaged in public, typically stores or fairs or even museums or what have you. But sometimes it can be at a crowded house or a workplace or what have you. Um, and then the items typically have no value, and often people will either stash away the items or they will return them even. Um, and the urges to steal are um, they come and go with variances in intensity. So basically, when to seek treatment is when one does not have power over this pattern of behavior. And like any addiction, there are cycles of change. Um, People will go through a period of, they don't have a problem with the pattern of behavior. Relatively rare for kleptomaniacs, but in a general sense, it can be true. In other words, people may not have insight that, like, hey, this is not a good thing to do. And as I said, kleptomaniacs, that's not often part of the process. And then there's the pre-contemplative phase where, well, that is the pre-contemplative phase rather. And then there's the contemplative phase where people are thinking, maybe I need to do something to stop this pattern, but they're not really fully committed to um, stopping the behavior. They're more afraid of stopping the behavior than they are of the behavior themselves, potentially, or there might seem to be too many obstacles to stopping the behavior. The early action phase then is when people start to intimate, reaching out to services, reaching out in order to stop the behavior. The action phase is generally, in the case of kleptomania, talking to a professional. Um, there are peer support groups for kleptomania, although they're relatively rare, analogous to 12-step programs that do use the 12-step model. However, Typically, this would involve a doctor, a mental health professional treating the individual and kind of laying out the groundwork. Recovery phase is where they are able to potentially change their relationship with shoplifting or kleptomaniac behaviors and then develop different pathways to address whatever it might be going on psychologically when they engage in shoplifting. And then there's relapse. With any addiction, an individual go through a long period of not engaging in the addictive behavior and then fall back into it based upon several factors. It can be significant life stressors. It can be an abundance of environmental temptations, like they go to a store that they used to habitually shoplift at and haven't been there for a long time, or what have you. Most of the time, rather, a lot of the time, I don't have specific numbers on this. A lot of people don't seek medical help until they get caught and have legal problems. And in a litigious sense, theft under is relatively rarely prosecuted. And for people who truly have kleptomania, they tend to be stealing items that have relatively little value economically. A pop, a candy bar, a pen, um, a uh, a set of dice, and what have you. That is not as to say that people don't get in trouble, and that's not to say that people don't steal items of higher value, but rather people tend to steal items such that it goes unnoticed. And unless, a store clerk happens to catch them, sticking a pen in their arm or in the sleeve of their shirt rather, not their arm, it is relatively rare to be caught. It's generally the items stolen are generally not worth the time of people who might be looking at camera footage or security officials or what have you. And so it tends to go on a lot. However, people do get caught and do get prosecuted and are forced to address the behavior. Um, it is very important to note that, like with a lot of addictive behaviors, and this one is a little bit more so thought in this way, is that kleptomania and addiction in general is not a personal flaw. It is not a matter of that's a bad person. Rather, if it's truly kleptomania, it's a matter of impulse control and a lack of impulse control, a lack of control over the behavior. It's addictive. And thus expressing to someone gently in a non-judgmental sense, hey, I'm concerned about you because this behavior could get you hurt or could get you in trouble or could cost you your job or could cost you your loved ones or something important to them. And again, reemphasizing it's without judgment, it's without blame. It's not you're a bad person for doing this. It's you need help. So again, you emphasize that you're concerned about the person's health and well-being. You're concerned about the risks of compulsive stealing, such
Hmm.
as being arrested, losing a job, damaging a relationship. You understand with kleptomania, the urge of stealing is not very easily resisted, and there are treatment options available. Now, there's a lot of ways to prepare for that conversation, and that might be something that might be left for a professional as well. Now, I can go into the kind of the causes a little bit, but to be clear, there's not any one known cause. Rather, it's a confluence of various factors, um, and some of them are inherent, some of them are environmental. So, and some of it, like they're learned patterns that are learned over a long period of time and reinforced and reinforced and reinforced. Your brain is naturally going to seek dopamine and serotonin and things that control mood and reward behavior. And if this is a pattern that's been repeated, that is a pathway to those reward hormones that has been well worn in an individual's brain. And to not engage in the behavior, the individual has to learn how to be conscientious of those patterns and tread other patterns, essentially. So, cause one can be a problem, a natural problem with serotonin production, which regulates mood and emotions. And low levels of serotonin are very common things for individuals who have impulse disorders or behavioral addictions. Addictive disorders Stealing may cause the release of dopamine, as I said, another neurotransmitter, and it causes feelings of pleasure. And that pattern of seeking that reward behavior becomes very well grouped in the that reward hormone rather becomes very well grouped in the brain. Additionally, the brain's opioid system and urges are connected to that, and that can cause an inability to resist temptation. And again, as I've said, it's a learned habit. Um, it becomes this is just something I do, and it's impulsive, and it's on kind of my menu of behavioral options. Um, and those long-term learned habits are very hard to break. Now, risk factors, um, again, we don't know the necessary cause, but these are factors that kind of increases someone's chance of having kleptomania. A blood relative, a close blood relative, parent, sibling, grandparent who has kleptomaniac or addictive disorders. So in other words, if you have a parent who has an eating disorder or a parent who has alcoholism, that makes you all the more likely to engage in a, a behavioral addiction such as kleptomania. And other mental illnesses tend to run concurrently or comorbidly with kleptomania. A lot of people with kleptomania, anxiety and depression are very, very common for people with kleptomania, in part because those disorders like anxiety, your brain is feeling a threat is coming, whereas depression, you're inherently a constitutionally very low mood, and a shortcut to a spike of dopamine makes both of those sensations feel better. So there tends to be a lot of comorbidity with behavioral disorders and those mental health diagnoses. And also substance use disorder tends to run concurrent because it's the same pattern, minus kleptomania is the same pattern as alcoholism minus the physiological impacts of the alcohol. Now, the complications or the results, um, aside from damage to job and family and legal ramifications, also other impulse control disorders or behavioral addictions, especially gambling addiction or compulsive shopping, uh, kind of go hand in glove with uh, shoplifting or kleptomania. Um, and because the brain pathways are very similar. On the whole, gambling addiction is very much on the rise in the last roughly 10 years, especially people under the age of 30. And shoplifting addiction has a lot of the same neural pathways that does gambling addiction. So it can be a gateway for gambling problems. And again, substance use and alcoholism are much higher for people with kleptomania. Kleptomania also tends to have an overlap with personality disorders. And I believe we're talking about personality disorders in a later discussion, so we can revisit that. Eating disorders, and as mentioned, bipolar depression and anxiety, and also in part due to the sense of helplessness, um, there is increased pattern of suicidal thoughts and suicidal actions associated with kleptomania. And that can relate to the pattern of shame and guilt and lack of control over the pattern of the behavior. There isn't any one known cause, however, but I would advise anyone who is experiencing concern about a loved one or themselves having features of kleptomania reach out to a mental health professional in order to get help. It's something that you can get treated for, generally therapy, and it is worth it because
Indeed.
you your quality of life is better, and there's always a
Yes.
sense of an anxiety and fear of getting caught or losing something associated with the disorder, and then guilt and shame as well.
And there's always hope, Ernest, right?
I'm sorry, I didn't hear that last
There
piece.
is always hope, I mean.
There's always hope, and I am very much. It's never too late to get help for such things. It's never that, it's too late to, well, I've had this problem for 40 years. It just is part of who I am. No, it's never too
Well,
late.
indeed, indeed. Well, thank you so much, Ernest, for this wonderful, fruitful information.
No problem.
We're always happy to host you in our sessions. Those are really magnificent and well-informed pieces that will address, a certain and critical aspects of our daily life. So thank you so much for providing all of that knowledge and wisdom to us.
You're very, very welcome. I'm very happy to talk about these issues, and I really believe that, you know, people have every right and every ability to reach out for mental health support. And the more we take away shame, the more we talk about it out loud, the more people are able to do so. So I very much appreciate the opportunity
Of
greatly. Thank you.
course, thank you so much. And for everyone, stay well, stay safe, and we are looking forward to see you at another session with Rights and Responsibilities Awareness Initiative. Thank you.